This is good, Ned. Things have been good.
Yeah, it's good. I I wish it was bigger. I've been actually looking for another building to buy. I've actually been chasing buildings and they all get snapped up. They
Yeah,
all either go off the market because the people just want more money than the building really is worth, or
yeah,
they get snapped up by marijuana growers more more quickly than I can, or they don't get snapped up. The marijuana growers are just happy to lease the building
yeah,
so it doesn't end up actually getting sold.
yeah. You're
So
gonna be like a warehouse mogul in out in North Portland.
that's I'm trying. I mean, I feel like there are worse things to be than a
Oh yeah,
warehouse
no,
mogul.
it's a great time to be a warehouse mogul. I mean, I want to be in that game.
I can just hide out in this warehouse here. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
Just build another floor on top of it.
Yep. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, let's start talking about Umbria. Um,
Right. I like
yeah.
Umbria.
So like I said in my handout there, I was like, Italy. Italy is this country with this huge winemaking, this long winemaking history. They've been making wine here forever and stuff like that. And there's all these famous wine regions. Um, and when you think of the top five most famous wine regions in Italy, Umbria is not on that list. Umbria
No,
is nowhere near being on that list.
no,
And there's nowhere, and even if you're not talking about states in Italy, if you're talking about communes or whatever, like
yeah,
there's nowhere really. I mean, Sagrantino is starting to get internationally famous, but
yeah.
that's
That's
it.
about it.
Umbria really is uh I don't know. It's just not like fancy, exciting is not what Umbria does,
Right.
really.
Yeah,
Um
not historically. Yeah, not historically.
yeah. I was I was reading different things about the economy in Umbria, and it said that of I mean, Umbria is an agricultural, I mean, a powerhouse is probably not the right word, but Umbria is of very agricultural, productive place, and they are famous for that and everything.
Yeah,
A lot of different books I was looking at mentioned the green heart of
yeah,
Italy, as call Umbria that.
of course.
But of all the agricultural output in Umbria and the land devoted to agricultural production, only 5% is actually devoted to grapevines. That most
Yeah,
of it is devoted to tobacco,
yeah.
grain,
Grain,
cattle, stuff like
potatoes,
that.
lentils. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, all those other things.
yep. No, it's true. And I mean, I think that, hi guys, I haven't met a lot of you all, but I'm Matt from Selection Natural, and I import a bunch of wines from Italy. And Ned and I have been working together for a long time. So if I haven't met you each in person, I'm based in Massachusetts, so I'm not that far away from you guys. Some of you, I don't know if you're all in the kind of Portland area today or from other parts of Maine today, but I live in Ipswich, so just like an hour and a half away. And I love coming up there and seeing you guys when I can. And hopefully soon we'll be able to do that again. And honestly, for me, Umbria is it's become a bit of a hub in a wheel, for lack of a better metaphor, for my portfolio of Italian wines. It's a thing that I import maybe 30 producers, 30, 35 small producers from all over Italy, from the Dolomites in the north to Sicily and Puglia in the south. But the highest percentage of the producers that I work with come from Umbria. And it's mostly because of my personal passion for the region and its underdog kind of status. Like Ned was just talking about, it's a tiny little region, and it gets overlooked. It gets overshadowed by Tuscany to the north. It doesn't have any major cities like Florence or Rome in it. It has smaller cities that are great, but it's most
I
known.
was looking, yeah, the total population of Umbria is 800 something thousand people.
Yeah, it's small. It's small. It's a largely rural area. It does have some commercial centers to it, and in and around Perugia, which is kind of the biggest economic that's there. And that's sort of right at the kind of the central part of Umbria, if you will. That kind of it's where the Tiber River Valley kind of connects. And it's right before you get into the southern Apennines, going towards Abruzzo and Le Marche, and it's sort of cornered. Umbria is sort of like cornered by mountain regions and very important, sort of bigger, well-known regions like Tuscany in terms of the wine, especially Tuscany, and Lazio, especially for its commercial power, because it has Rome down there. And I think like one of the coolest things that a producer talked to me about in the past with regard to Umbria and its economy was the fact that I think this is back in the 50s or 40s, there was a very smart mayor of a city in Tuscany called Arezzo, which, if you've heard of Arezzo or known Arezzo, it's just over the Umbrian border. It's sort of in southeastern Tuscany, and it's not far away from the border of Umbria. But it's essentially at a crossroads where there's a big Lake Trasimeno, in the northern part of Umbria. And if and this very smart, this very, Italians would say furbo, very cunning mayor of Arezzo actually lobbied and petitioned, and it was really smart. And he got them to build the train line to go from Rome to Florence on that side, on the northern side of Lake Trasimeno, going through Arezzo. And what that essentially did was cut off Umbria from mainline transportation. This is back in the 50s and 40s, whenever they were doing that sort of major post-World War reconstruction. And that's just a modern little inkling of what's been going on for centuries. Umbria has always been sort of this like quiet, more rural and more monastic place. It's always been tied to the popes, to the Vatican. Assisi is really a major religious center in Italy and in the world. It's like a place where international pilgrimages go. And it's unlike Tuscany, which was run by sort of barons and sort of bankers, the Medici and things like this. Umbria was for friars and for monasteries. And so like there's that concept kind of trickles into even the wines of the region, where they're often a little more rustic, a little more simple, a little less sort of internationalized. And I mean, I think that that's the beauty of Umbrian wine. I also think that it's part of the charm, but there's reasons why it's not famous. And like Ned, you mentioned Montefalco, which is, I think Montefalco, I think that it's famous because they were smart. They looked at what was happening in Montalcino and Montepulciano up in Tuscany, and they said, those guys are famous. They have a hill town that starts with an M, and so do we. And we have a famous grape here that you can't grow anywhere else. And in the 80s, they said, let's try to put this place on the map, kind of like Brunello has done for itself. And I wouldn't say it quite has had the same sort of like lightning in a bottle experience that you find with Montepulciano and Montalcino, but that said, I think Montefalco has created itself its own little kind of microcosm, for what I would call like aristocratic wine in Umbria, if there is a thing like
Yeah.
that. But the wines we're going to show today are much more on the historically humble, simple, and in some ways like progressive. They're sort of throwbacks, but the throwbacks are sort of like a progression of what's going on in Umbrian wine, right, Ned? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I've like I talk about this in every single wine seminar that I do.
Yeah.
Um, I talk about how like if you're in somewhere like you're in like Côte d'Or proper, or you're in like Santa Steph, like you're not gonna revolutionize things. You're not gonna like throw out what you're doing and reinvent everything and stuff like that. You're gonna be like, oh great, like I'm making money, and also at the same time like I had to pay this much money for the land, or I inherited the land from my family, and even though I didn't have to pay for it, like this land is everything my family has. Like, this is our entire inheritance. Like, I need to pass this on to the next generation
Yeah.
financially in good shape. I can't lose this. And so, like, you do what the market wants. Then when you get into other places that are less famous, like Umbria or like the Ardèche in the Rhone or somewhere like that, like
Yeah.
that's where
Very.
there's the flexibility to
Yeah.
experiment and do cool stuff.
Totally.
Um, I
Totally.
remember I'm going to run through like some of what the history that's on here on the handout quickly, but I
Yeah.
remember when we were in Italy in the spring of 2017 and we were at Paterna together over in Arezzo, and
Yeah.
you were talking about how Tuscany is so different from Umbria, that they have a real like just the whole like there's a different culture there, because Umbria was a part of was the Papal States was run by the Catholic Church.
Yep.
Um, and I think that that really like that was when I first like had even heard of the Papal States,
Yeah.
and and then like learned more about them and stuff like that. But so Umbria, I think it's also important sort of to mention that Umbria is landlocked. That
Yes.
Umbria is the only state in like central Italy and on the Italian peninsula that doesn't have any coastline. I think
Right.
it's the only Italian state that has no coastline and doesn't border a foreign country.
Exactly.
Every
Exactly.
other Italian state either like borders a foreign country or is on the coast and stuff like that. And so a lot of them were more are all of those places are sort of more like outward looking.
Yeah.
But Umbria, um, you have the Apennine Mountains in the east that it's pushed up against, and the Apennines are like real legit mountains
Oh
that
yeah.
are rural and like and empty, and they are a real like geographic barrier.
Yep.
Um, you have some more mountains sort of to the north, and then you have Tuscany, and then you have Rome and Lazio to the south and to the west down there. So
Yeah.
it's really like Umbria ended up being more inward looking.
Yeah.
Um, it was a pretty prosperous region under the Romans. There's been winemaking in Umbria going back before recorded history. There's uh I'm looking forward to the new like your new producer, Ortaccio,
Yeah.
because are they in Orvieto, or they're around Orvieto?
They're technically in Lago di Bolsena near like Viterbo. So they're just on the border of Lazio and Umbria. And it's like a spot. And I work with another producer in Orvieto, Fermento, really small, that we just started with last year. And that's a project that Danilo is working with too.
Yep.
And those guys are on the border of Orvieto, are in Orvieto. But yeah, there's a crossroads there. And Umbria has a little bit more. If there were an easy way to get out of Umbria, it's like going south down the Tiber to Rome. And so
Yep.
like if they do have an economic kind of like tether, it's probably the river down to Rome, you know?
Yep. Yeah. Um, but I was reading about the subterranean, the wine caves
Yeah.
in Orvieto that were cut
Yes.
by the Etruscans
In
there,
Cuneo,
that go
yes. In
back
Cuneo limestone.
thousands and thousands of years and
Yeah.
stuff. So
Yeah.
there's been winemaking here forever. Um, After the fall of Rome, Umbria was invaded by different cultures and stuff like that. And then for a while, it was ruled by the Lombards. The Lombards set it up as the Duchy of Spoleto, and Spoleto was the capital of it. And that sort of like that went on for a while, and there was some stability. But then the Lombards lost power, and then Umbria went back to sort of being like kicked around between the Holy Roman Emperor, like Frederick Barbarossa came and burned down, I think it was Spoleto, like conquered Spoleto. The Saracens came through, like they were just constant. It was kicked around between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Ghibellini. Yep.
and then it became a part of the Papal States. So it was given to the Pope and to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church administered it. But then not too long after that, this came up last week when we were talking about the Rhone. The Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor arrested the Pope, and the Pope mysteriously passed away. And
Yeah.
then the Holy Roman Emperor, the French, who was French, he elected a new Pope who was French, and that French Pope stayed in Avignon in France. And so the papal court left Italy, and so the Papal States, like then sort of no one really cared about Umbria for a
Yeah.
while. And so Umbria was conquered by different condottieri, like basically local warlords. What's his name? Sforza from Milan conquered part of Umbria for a while. And I ran into, did I put their name in here? I think I did. Did I not? The
Borghese. Yeah.
there was the Caesar Borgia, but there was the Bolini. I think it was the Bolini family. It was a family that were like sort of local nobles that took over Perugia. They were from Perugia. They took over Perugia, and they weren't like, no one actually recognized them as being actual aristocrats or being in
Right.
charge, but they defied the Pope. They defied everybody for it was over 100 years.
Yeah.
It was in like 1540. The Pope tricked the patriarch, the guy in charge, tricked him to come to Rome for like a meeting or something, and then had him beheaded. And then and like and
Classic.
finally reconquered Perugia. In reading about Umbria and trying to like follow, because Umbria wasn't like a cohesive like state. Like there were sort of different pieces and stuff, but Perugia rebelled against the Pope more times than I could keep track of. It was like every
Yeah.
several generations, Perugia would be like, "We're tired of this. Like, get out of here," and they'd stage an uprising and kick out like the forces of the Catholic Church. And then the Pope would send mercenaries, and they'd have a small war, and the Pope would reconquer Perugia, and it just went on and on and on, like until 1861, when you know
The
Italy happened. Victor Emmanuel started conquering
yeah.
Italy, and the Perugians rose up and were like, "Great, all right, we're joining Italy," and they like burnt down the fortress that the Pope had originally built and stuff like that, which is very different from Spoleto. Spoleto like wanted to stay a part of the Papal States, and Victor Emmanuel actually had to go and besiege Spoleto and like had a long fight to conquer Spoleto and finally incorporate Umbria into Italy
Yeah.
proper. But
Yeah.
yeah,
One of those famous rebellions, and it actually, I think it originated in Tuscany, and I think it, and I don't exactly remember. I'm sure you can find out the real dates. But when I was studying, I lived and studied in Perugia for a couple of years, and one of the things that you sort of learn early when you live there is that the bread doesn't have any salt in Umbria and in Tuscany too. But that goes back to a tradition. It's a little bit of a spiting of the Pope for taxing the salt. And so all the locals said, you know what, screw your salt, you can keep it. And they stopped salting their bread. And that tradition continues today. So if you buy pane comune, which is just like the daily bread in a little market that doesn't have any salt and it's quite bland. And of course, these days, you douse it in olive oil and you put salt on it. And that's how you fix the bread. But they still to this day make their table bread without salt in Tuscany and Umbria. And that goes back to what you were just talking about, a little bit of a spite. But back in those days, it was real business. These were minerals that were being mined, and salt being taxed was a big deal. So
yeah,
yeah, it's been a tumultuous region. It's like, the paradigm, the mentality of Umbrians is it's really interesting because it's a little bit like New Englanders in the sense that, a little bit of a closed community, of a little bit of a closed society mentally, until you get to know them, and then they're very warm and welcoming. But they're not like the famous Genovese or the Venetians, who are very open. These are people that live on the coast and have had this culture of openness and transient cultures coming through. Umbria has been a very closed community, and a little bit of that kind of fear of outsiders mentality, which it's still kind of pervasive in their mentality. I mean, to this day, I mean, in small ways, in their dialect, in their food choices. I know we're going to talk a lot about some of the wines that my friend and our friend Danilo Marcucci makes. And here's a guy who makes insanely progressive wines, who is the most stubborn Italian Umbrian guy that like only likes his meat and potatoes and pasta for food. And that's it. Basta. Like anything else is like, oh no, I'm not even trying that. Like forget it. We bring them over here to America. We go to some place like with night market or some Thai place or something for sushi. And he's like, hell no, I'm out. You know what I mean? So that's
Yeah.
a little taste of like a little stubborn Umbrian, element to him.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to touch on Umbria. It's not a big place, but the climate is different in different parts of it. Like
Oh yeah.
northern Umbria, like you have the Apennine Mountains over in the east, you have Lake Trasimeno up in the north, and in the south, like it's significantly warmer and the climate is more Mediterranean in the
Yep.
south, where in the north up by Lake Trasimeno, it's from what I was like reading, it's actually cooler than some of like the highlands of Chianti. Like so it's like it's it gets pretty cool up around Lake
Yeah.
Trasimeno,
Yeah.
and it snows in the winter and stuff like that. And like there's a couple of very different climates in Umbria. So even though it's not a big place, like you have these two river valleys, you have the Tiber River flowing through it, and then you have the Umbra Valley, and then you have the Apennine Mountains, and so you have like a lot of different sort of diverse like different climates, and then you have some places that are like flat plains, and then
Yeah.
you've got like really steep mountain areas and stuff like that. It's like sort of geologically, it's a complicated place
It is.
too. So which is good for winemaking. That's
It
what you
is.
that's what you want.
And it's like you said, it's all in a very small area. So like, like I said, I work with, I don't even know how many, 8, 9 producers from Umbria, and they're all within 30 to 40 minutes of each other. And some of them are within like 10 minutes of each other, but those properties couldn't be more different from each other. And like we talk about micro regionalism, microclimate all the time in wine, but it's really apparent when you're in a place like Umbria, because the whole entire region of Umbria is like the size of Rhode Island. You know what I mean? So it's a small area.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of diversity packed in there for sure.
Let's why don't we start talking about, since we were just
Yeah.
talking about Danilo, why don't we start
Yeah.
talking about Danilo, Northern Umbria?
Absolutely. So the first wine that you guys are trying is the Chepinat. And so this is really cool. This is a little intro to Danilo Marcucci, who is an absolute master of natural winemaking, considered really a guru by lots of Italian producers. And Danilo is a really interesting character because on one hand, he doesn't come from a winemaking background. He didn't study enology in a school. He studied winemaking in the school of the vineyards and learning from his grandfather in his youth, but then also sort of went and learned the ways of some of the great producers of Italy, the Edoardo Valentinis, the Lino Magas, the Francesco Rinaldi's, the greats, Gravner, Radicon, the people like this. And he would go and visit these producers, learn their work, spend time with them, see what they were doing in the vineyards and the cellars, and sort of bring that information into his mind and then go and experience it. And so he left a life of actually being like a wine salesman. He did what I did. He was essentially a wine merchant, and but he was selling conventional wines back in the day, 25 years ago, and got very sick of them, mostly because, whoa, okay, I see what's going on. That
Yeah.
freaked me out. um,
Ooh.
I thought my computer crashed. And so he was so he was making these wines, or so he was selling conventional wines and got very sort of bored of them and very ill from them, from all the additives, and decided to leave that world and venture into the world of winemaking himself. And so that began about 20 years ago, and he slowly started to start working with small producers in his region. And he learned from some great producers around him, like Colli Capretta, who we're going to taste their wine later. And he became essentially a guide, a mentor, and a collaborator, and a person that helped guide these producers into making wine without additives, and also sort of like bringing out the Umbrian tradition. And so that's like a little background nugget on Danilo. Skip to what he does right now. He consults with about 8 or 9 wineries around Umbria and a couple in other regions, like in the Veneto and Trentino. And then he has his own projects, which are the two projects that we're going to try today. The Ceppaiolo project, which is the Cep and Nat wine you guys are tasting right now. And this is a tiny, tiny vineyard site in central Umbria. And Ned was talking about the different kind of aspects and terroirs of Umbria. This is a spot here where you're in the absolute valley. The elevation is quite low. You're in the river basin essentially, and here you're looking at this tiny little single vineyard spot. Is all there is. There's about 5 rows of vines, and it's only a tiny little place called Ceppaiolo. It means the land of the woodworker that would actually harvest just stumps of trees and stumps of vines to make a living. And so this tiny little bunker with no electricity and no running water and no bathroom, especially no bathroom, is where they make the Ceppaiolo wines. And it's a spot where, I mean, he can tinker. He calls it his laboratory. There's no rules here. Every vintage is different. Every wine is different. And yeah, it's a really unique spot. It's really all about this vineyard site, this one vineyard that has mostly white grapes in it, and it's a blend of different native varieties, especially these Trebbiano varieties and variations that grow there. And that's, I think, what's in the Chepanat is I think it's either all Trebbiano or a combination of the 3 or 4 different Trebbiano varieties that he has in the vineyard site. So he bottle ferments it, of course. So it's a pet nat. What he'll do is ferment the wine into a still wine in the early part in the primary fermentation process, and then during the springtime, this time of year right now, he'll re-ferment it using conserved must. And but that said, he doesn't make the pet nat every year. There's no rules. Like every wine is different. He goes with what nature gives him in that particular vintage. And in this vintage, he was able to make a frizzante wine, or a desire to make frizzante wine because of the grapes. How's it tasting, Ned? I haven't had it in a minute.
It's prickly, kind of citrusy, like a little bit of like a white grapefruit, a little lemony.
Sometimes, at least when you first open it, sometimes I would remember getting like sometimes like some pineapple tones to it, like a semi-tropical tone.
Yeah.
Yeah, like white
Yeah.
grapefruit pith, like the citrus bitter tone, and then kind of that salty finish that I think is kind of classic from a wine that Danilo makes.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, it's a little pithy, and it actually, I don't know. It's just, this is the thing about tasting wine. Like, you taste and smell things like from your experience. To me, it reminds me of Orangina, and I
Oh
loved
yeah,
Orangina
Orangina. I
growing up.
love
Like
Orangina.
that pulpy, yeah.
Yeah.
And Michael Boland, did
So,
you?
so tell us how we're going to sell this, right? Tell us how we're going to tell the customer this is a great wine. To me,
Yeah,
it's
sure.
a good wine, but tell me why I can tell the customer you should get this and not a cider.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know why you shouldn't get this, not a cider. I think that a cider drinker would actually really love this. And I think that that's actually a great thing, is to sort of see where people are at. And if they're sort of, these are types of wines, especially these pet nats, that sort of, they do have a little bit for people that like sometimes the sour beers, things like that. This is a type of wine that I think is, if they're not into wine or want to experiment, could be a bit of a gateway drug for that sort of thing. What I would say is, like, to me, the way I like to sell this wine or talk about this wine is, often a great pet nat like this is all about sort of wetting the whistle, like getting someone's appetite like enticed and making them thirsty, making them ready to drink something. So if you're in a restaurant setting or you're setting up for a dinner party, like serve this at the beginning of the meal with some snacks, with some salumi, some cheese, stuff like that. I mean, it has that beautiful kind of sour tone to it. And, you're also just drinking a little piece of Umbrian like history when you're drinking it. It's some of the
Yeah, this
oldest
is,
vines that grow in Umbria.
this is fun and refreshing and thirst quenching. It's like, it's very lively. It wakes your palate up. It's frothy like a beer.
Yeah.
Like, this is not trying to replace champagne. That's
No,
not
no.
what this, the purpose of this is. Like, this is a fun, frothy, like thirst quenching thing, and it's got that like that fruitiness to it. But what it then it also has this savory quality, you know, because it has all of that sediment and live yeast and stuff left in it. So, you know, I mean, it's not something to sell to everybody, and it's not in large enough supply to sell to everybody. You know, do you even have any more of this, Matt?
Uh, Unknown, probably not. I don't know the
Yeah.
answer.
I think
Probably
I
not.
have like a case and a half of it. You know, like that's the thing. Like we only ever get because it's such a tiny winery. Like this,
The
it's his
whole
test kitchen. You know, so
exactly.
things like this, like this is something fun for like people who are outside, like with actually, I think this would actually be awesome with mussels, like steamed
Yeah,
mussels with
totally.
like the meatiness and the sort of earthiness of them. You know,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's the
Umbrian mussels, Umbrian mussels for all those coastal,
yeah,
but
real
no, but it's
savory.
like farmhouse to me, like a wine like that. The essence of it is like a farmhouse wine. It's simple, it's rustic, it's thirst quenching. It's not overly serious as a wine, but that said, the beauty of what Danilo is doing with his winemaking, whether it's at his project, his personal project like Ceppaiolo, or with other producers, is he's making wines that all of us want to drink, but he's using the materials and the ingenuity and the tradition from a place that have existed for a long time. And so when you drink the Cepanat, you're drinking something fun, and you don't have to think about it, and you don't have to worry about what grape it is, but you happen to be like drinking wine from some of the oldest vines in Umbria, and it's got a little historical piece to it. So it's like, and that's just kind of like a cool thing, because that helps things continue. The long story of Ceppaiolo, for just a tidbit, is that vineyard site was a friend of Danilo's, a really good friend named Ricardo. It was his uncle, or it was his grandfather's plot of land, and his grandfather passed away, and they were going to sell the land. And Ricardo called Danilo. He's like, "Hey, look at this vineyard." And he's like, "I got to sell this." You know what I mean? It's right down in kind of the suburbs of Perugia. And it's basically like one of those places that they were going to like sell. It could have been turned into a parking lot, and
Where was it
instead
down in
they started
Peru?
making wine out of it. Yeah, it's in it's right in a town called, it's in the town right there, but like where the Torgiano tea is, it's called Bastia Umbria, and it's
Ostia Umbria, right? Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like right, yeah, exactly where you're at there.
Okay.
So it's kind of in the lowlands between Assisi and Perugia. So yeah, it's really cool. Yeah, totally a great starter wine, aperitif, rustic aperitif, and absolutely a cool side recommendation for the people that like cider or ale or goose beer, stuff like that.
Yeah. And then
Tiberi Lil Bianco. Yeah, cool. So this was a really cool story. These guys talk about the small world of Umbria. So this is the Tiberi Lil Bianco, means little Bianco, and it's a white wine with some skin contact, as you can see. And this comes from a little bit further north. So if you got in your car and drove from Ceppaiolo, it would probably take you about 30 minutes, and it would be over. Yeah, exactly. It's in a town there. Is it on this map? I don't think so, but there's Lake Trazi, Monte Molino. So you see this town called Monte Molino on this map right there? That's where La Staffa is. And let me see, it's not on this map. So Montemolino is where La Staffa is. So sort of on the southern cusp of Lake Trasimeno. And these guys are in a town called, no, it's not even that far away, but it's in a town called Monte Petriolo, which is down by that town called probably Mugnana, really small little village. And it's only about 20 minutes away from where Danilo makes his wine and lives. And about, let's see, 2014 was their first vintage. And the Tiberi family, young guy Federico, was the third generation of winemakers at this small family house. And basically what was going on was this producer was making and selling the grapes, was basically growing grapes and only making a little bit of wine for their own family. But the only way they were able to support their farm, which is about 3 hectares, was to sell the grapes to the local cooperative. And this, I'm sure, Ned, if you've talked, I'm sure if you guys hear Ned talk about this concept before, but especially small family farms that were operating, from maybe the 50s and 60s. Back in those days, everybody had their own little farm and they just made wine and for their own consumption. But then as time went on, people started to drink less and less as people started to buy wine in supermarkets. And what ended up happening was these producers either had to sell the farm or make it smaller or start selling the grapes to actually keep their business alive. And what that did was basically it brought in a total era of quantity over quality, and so it basically drove these small producers to use fertilizers, use chemicals, overcrop their vines, and sell the most grapes they could for the most money. That is essentially what was happening at Tiberi, except what was the beauty was they never used any of the chemicals, and they always made wine on their own, for their own terms and for their own consumption. Back in 2014, Danilo saw this project again, really right down the street. He met Federico by chance at a soccer game for his son. And they started talking, and it turns out he was like 20 minutes away. And Danilo went and saw this property, and they were like, yeah, let's do this. And this was really cool because this family, the Tiberi family, has mostly white grape varieties in this tiny 3-hectare vine. These guys are really small. So I believe what's in this blend, this is their classic blend. It's Trebbiano, very old vine Grechetto, a small amount of Malvasia, and then a little bit of a really important, really unknown grape called San Colombana, which is, sort of this semi-aromatic kind of like juicy grape variety that I think adds like something really special to this wine. And this is wine. This is something like, I don't know, you guys are tasting it. To me, it's always all about like this really fresh, herbaceous feel. It's very sunny wine. Like Ned mentioned the Mediterranean aspect. This is like a very southwest facing vineyard site. So it's very warm, very dry, very windblown. And the wines are always very warm and very generous. And so I feel like when you drink this wine, what would I recommend this with? For sure, this is something with like cheeses, pecorino, meat, white meat, fish. I mean, it's just a really cool, balanced skin contact wine, but with just a little bit of skin contact, not too much, just enough to kind of kiss it and make it a little bit more textured. How's that showing, Ned?
It's very different from the Chepanat, like very different flavors. It smells like it's a little bit more like wildflowers, it's more aromatic.
Yeah, I love that one.
It's a little bit sort of like white peachy smelling.
Cool. I mean, this is a great wine for like, yeah, with cod, with salmon, with chicken dishes, saltimbocca. There's the Tiberi family. There's Federico. Right? Yep. There's Paulo, his dad. There's Danilo.
Yeah.
And there's Ned when he ran. This is when they ran their accidental like double marathon.
Yeah, single marathon. It was a single marathon.
I know it was supposed to be, but you guys went like all over the place.
Well, yeah, right. Because it's so close. We were leaving Danilo's winery, and he like got out his phone to figure out like how to get there and how far away it was. And when you're starting a run and someone gets out like Google Maps to figure out where you're going, that's a bad sign.
Bad. And it's
but he was like, oh, this is only 14 kilometers away. This isn't far enough for us. We're real men. We need to go farther. And I was like, great.
Awesome. Took the long way, which was really long way.
There's Danilo. We got there and like Danilo just collapsed over there, and I like collapsed in the shade of this tree, and we were just lying in their parking lot.
It was like, when was it? August or September? It was warm.
It was early October, so it was like it was hot. It was like it was like 85, like it was high. It was high 80s, middle of the day, just in the sun. Yeah. Anyway.
Man. But this is their farmhouse, and their family is basically, what's really cool about Tiberi is They had a grandfather that made wine. They have all three of the generations still in place, still alive. And they have the grandfather Cesare, who was, this is a guy who's made 80 vintages of wine. And I'm not exaggerating that. You know, this guy has been making wine his entire life. And he still goes out there and prunes the vines and ties the vines up and everything like that. And so you have Cesare, and then you have Paolo, who is the father of Federico, and Paolo was like this guy caught in the middle, right? Because he had to keep the farm going, but at the same time, you know, also was raising a family and needed to like make money and make it actually like a viable thing. And that was when Paolo ran the farm. That was when they had to sell off 95% of the grapes, and that was when basically Tiberi was not a winemaker, was not a winery, you know, and they weren't a winery for all intents and purposes. Then in 2014, along comes Federico. He gets older. He gets very interested in winemaking, and he goes, he didn't go to school for winemaking. He needed help. He had all the materials right there, but he didn't know how to turn it into wine, and he certainly didn't know how to turn it into natural wine. And that's where the help of someone like Danilo comes in, because Danilo comes in and goes, look, you have great materials. These are the direction we have to go with. And then they start going that direction. And every single vintage from Tiberi has gotten better and better. And they're going to be, you know, I mean, wow, they started in 2014. In a few years, they'll have made 10 vintages. Is crazy. You know what I mean? I remember tasting their first bottles of wine. And I was really excited about them. And I love the little Bianco. I love it this time of year. It's a very springtime wine to me. Like you said, it has a little more aromatic bounce. It's got a flowery tone to it. Super fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next, Case Sparse. So this was the marathon that they ran. They ran between L'Estafa and Tiberi, and it started at L'Estafa. This is a blend of Trebbiano and Grechetto, 50% Trebbiano, 50% Grechetto. Basically 24 hours of skin contact. So the way they'll make the wine is they'll harvest the grapes, they de-stem them right away. So they remove the stems from the bunches. They don't crush the grapes at that moment. What they do is basically toss them into a vertical basket press. And during that time, they don't even put the press on it. They just let the grapes sit there and drain. And it goes very, very slowly. And in that process, you're already doing some skim maceration. Then you let the wine ferment in open top fermenters, and then you age it in stainless steel or fiberglass, whatever container they have, you know, for that particular vintage in that wine. And it's this features Grechetto, which maybe you've heard of, had before. I love Grechetto. It's a really an Umbrian variety. It has this nuttiness to it. It has a tendency to oxidize, you know, so it always brings out like a little bit of that like almondy, you know, minty kind of herbaceous tone to it. Plus you have the cut and the drive, the mineral tone from the Trebbiano, which is a really neutral, relatively high acidity grape variety. And the combination of those things is perfect. This is like my favorite little intro to orange wine for people, you know. And this is L'Estafa. This is the home vineyard site that Danilo is in there showing. Looks like around grafting time. That would be about this time of year. So this is like a springtime photo, it looks like to me.
Yeah,
and
this was late March 2018.
Yeah, exactly. I'm usually in Italy right now. Like usually the last 2 weeks in March is usually when I go for my spring trip. A little shot of a cool little section of land where you can see the strata and the striations of their land. You have lots of topsoil there, and then you have a big layer of calcareous limestone underneath that. And this is really kind of like an important, you have clay, sand, and limestone all layered like that. And the vines go straight into that, and you build up this, you build up this really great mineral background in the wines. And this is sort of the typical construction of the land. It's not where every piece of land is. Some land is, of course, rockier, but around Lake Trasimeno, this is the classic combination of soil composition. But yeah, L'Estafa, Case Sparse, beautiful little table wine. I love that wine personally. It's just, like I said, it's a great introduction to skin contact without going overboard.
Yeah. This smells this smells a little bit more sort of orangey. Like this is more like orange, like like orange juice with pulp and meat in it and stuff like
Yeah,
that. Like it is different again from the other two,
great.
but it has some of that same like it's a pretty aroma. It's a pretty like slightly aromatic, like flowery, but also sort of orangey.
Yeah. And it's important to note that like Umbrian white wines, especially, are not overly aromatic. Like the grape varieties, especially Grechetto and Trebbiano, are pretty neutral when it comes to that. The only grape variety that offers some more vivid aromatics is Malvasia. And Danilo, from a personal standpoint, doesn't like to tinker too much with Malvasia because he doesn't want wines to be overly aromatic. He feels when the wine is really overly aromatic, it gets in the way of the terroir when someone's drinking it. He wants the wine to be salty, saline, what the Italians called sapidità, and makes the wine sort of a better food pairing than something that overly aromatic can kind of be, over the top sometimes.
Yeah. I feel like I can taste the Grechetto in this more. Like Grechetto is to me makes wine that's like a little bit, it has like a little bit more minerally salty structure usually than Trebbiano.
Yeah,
And this on the like the mid palate and the finish of this, there's a spicy quality
yeah.
that is very much like that. I think is the Grechetto coming through in this.
Totally. I think Grechetto, to me, like the typical things is like a waxiness, almost like a candle wax, or like that
Yeah.
sort of like a little more glycerol, like a little rounder tone. And that puts this wine, even though it's relatively light on its feet, I would call it a medium-bodied white wine and like something super versatile with food, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. I get waxy on like the finish of it. Yeah.
What's next? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Powerhouse.
Right.
That's a real treat, guys. You guys are, I don't think I even tasted that this year. Very special indeed. This is from Colli Capretta. This is the Rosato of their house rosé, if you will. And so Colli Capretta, extremely, really great winery. I struggle actually to talk about these guys because they're so I'm so like personally connected with them. They're like my family in Umbria, and the Mattioli family. This was a producer, we were talking about the culture of Umbria, but it was never more sort of stark to me than when I first discovered these guys. This is before there were GPSs on phones, and I had just like a burner phone in Italy and didn't even have a GPS in my car, and found these guys and was like, taken aback by what they were doing in this tiny little hamlet called Terzo La Pieve. And it's in southern Umbria. We're down in Spoleto now. So it's a little warmer area, a little more Mediterranean influence. But these guys are high in the hills. So they have almost sort of this combination of hills with exposure of sunlight to really make special wines. The Rosato is 100% Ciliegiolo. Ciliegiolo, if you haven't heard of or had or can't pronounce, that's totally normal. Ciliegiolo means little cherries in Italian, and essentially it refers to this type of grape variety being all about freshness and all about what I would call the pulp. This is the wine that basically, or the grape variety that makes the juice of a wine, and it's often been a blending variety, something that you would only be blending into something like Sangiovese, Canaiolo, other Chianti blends like that. And you can see those hills in the background. This is Annalisa. She's amazing. Annalisa Mattioli. She's the winemaker at Colli Capretta along with her dad. And this is basically one of the old vineyard sites that we're in. It's called the Vigna Vecchia, and it basically has a little bit of every grape variety that they grow in their small 7-hectare family farm. And the Ciliegiolo is something really special. It's something you really traditionally find in Umbria. It's kind of the home base of it. And you find it in other parts of Tuscany and little bits of Liguria. And it's actually undergoing a bit of a renaissance right now. I mean, when I first started importing wine over 10 years ago, I always loved Ciliegiolo, and I always talked to my producers that I was working with about Ciliegiolo, and they'd always maybe have a little bit here and there, but they never really vinified a lot of it, except people like Colli Capretta. And those are the kind of wines I was on the hunt for, because they're so satisfying and they're so tied to their place. So you guys are having the Rosado. I mean, that's their tiny winery. It's basically a garage full of a few winemaking things. It's amazing, and this is their home. Like, this is their house and winery right there. So, it's everything. They live
Winery downstairs, house upstairs.
exactly,
Boom.
their kitchen table, like that door right there where those flower pots are, goes like straight into their kitchen, So it's a special spot. And this is a family that can trace their Umbrian origin back to like the 1400s. They're an old Umbrian family, and they make some really special wines. Hopefully, you're tasting and understanding that in that wine that you're tasting right now. The pure direct press Ciligiolo, really fantastic wine. This is that hill right there in the back. Round over there. That's Monte Subasio. That's the highest hill in Umbria, the highest mountain in Umbria. And the next photo is looking a little bit further to the southwest. And like, if you went that direction, you'd basically be going right towards Rome. And so you can kind of feel, you're sitting in the sun here tasting wine, and you can just feel that you're not that far from the Mediterranean, about an hour and a half away.
Yep. Yeah. And surrounded by hills and mountains.
And surrounded by hills, quite high hills too.
Yeah.
Some of the Apennines are big and cold, for sure. And that helps. You have these variations in the extreme warms during the day, cold evenings, which makes for great kind of ripeness, phenolic ripeness in the wines. So yeah, Lautizio, we call that one the Lautizio Light. It's the rosé version of their 100% Ciligiolo rosé.
Yeah, so while we're here on it, I can't help going to here we go. Yeah, here's pictures of the Apennines.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Here's out there,
backwoods,
just out in the woods.
This is when you found your skull, right? And yeah, that's like,
yep. I found that skull. There's a wolf footprint that's like larger than my foot.
That's like a Wolverine footprint. Jeez.
Wolverines are little. That was
I meant like a big, I don't know what I meant.
You mean like big wolf. Yeah, but this is out in the mountains. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, and the Apennines are really cool. That wine there, how's that drinking, Ned? That must be pretty cool.
It's really pretty. It's like dry, like wild cherries, some cranberries in the aroma. Also a little like orangey, but more like blood orange, like pithy blood orange.
Yeah, sanguinello. I know what you mean.
Really, like, it's got great acidity, but it's got great like saltiness and minerality too on the palate. Like it's really alive and like wakes my palate up.
Yeah, it like penetrates that saltiness, that mineral tone in the wines. It penetrates the palate, and even when you taste several wines back to back, or when you're having food, that's really the essence of great Italian wine. Is it should be palate cleansing, it should be refreshing, and it should make you ready to eat some more of whatever's coming next. And sort of, I always find it tough to taste true, real deal Italian wine, without a snack, or when you disassociate the food from the wine, it's tough sometimes, for sure.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. Bag of tricks.
Number 5.
Is that the Il Rosso?
That's the Il Rosso. Yeah, this is 2017.
Right. So 2017 Rosso. This was the 2017. Then that means, Ned, that was the year you were there.
Right. That's the year that I was there. Yeah, working on barrels and stuff with Danilo.
Yeah. So if you like it, then it's Ned made the wine, and if you hate it, it's Ned's fault. So
it had nothing to do with this one.
No, but this is back at La Staffa, the same place that we tasted the Grechetto and Trebbiano blend Case Sparse. And this is the Il Rosso, just means the red wine, the table wine. I personally love this cuvee from L'Estafa. L'Estafa makes a bunch of different wines. I find this one really satisfying because it combines the juiciness of ripe Sangiovese with a little bit of Ciliegiolo, a little bit of Canaiolo, and I think in some vintages, and I'm not sure, but back in the original vintages, there was even a tiny little dash of Sagrantino that was going into this wine. And they had a couple plants, not a lot of it, just a little bit, not even enough to call a percentage, but a few plants, a few vines in the vineyard are Sagrantino. And I have a feeling some of the grapes would make it into this wine. And it just lends itself to that like spicy richness. It's one of Danilo's kind of like classic cuvées. It's aged in, this one goes in stainless steel, not in the oak barrels that Ned was working in. And but it just has that like bounty of like richness. And this is like, so what is this? This is like Chianti Classico Reserva. Like this is for like when someone wants something like that, they feel like they want to have something traditional, but they also want to know they're tasting something kind of more vivid, alive, and really natural. So I don't know how it's showing today, but usually that's a big winner in my book. I love that wine.
There is pruning.
Cool. Yeah. That's also this time of year. So that's what a vineyard looks like before you go out and prune it, which is a huge task. You basically do that between January and spring. You basically do it over the winter. And usually by the equinox of spring, you're done pruning and tying all the vines, and then bud break happens relatively shortly after. And this vineyard site here is all Sangiovese spot, and part of this goes into the wine that you're tasting now.
Yeah.
So yeah, really cool.
It's the Sangiovese.
And of course, Sangiovese, is a well-known variety, unlike Ciliegiolo or Grechetto. Sangiovese has a big name, a big history, but Umbrian Sangiovese is different than Tuscan Sangiovese. And, Emilia-Romagnan Sangiovese is different than Tuscan or Umbrian Sangiovese. So all the Sangioveses have their own unique character. And of course, the producers have their own tilt on the way they want to go with it. But to me, this is super versatile. This is spaghetti and meatballs wine, or this is bistec alla Fiorentina wine. It's a real delicious everyday wine. For retail, it's lovable. I think anyone could enjoy that bottle of wine.
Yeah, this has a lot more. This has a lot of tannic structure. This is riper, denser.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I guess it is a good example of Sangiovese that it has a fair amount of tannin. It also has a lot of acidity. It has that like tannic acidic structure.
Without the oak, the thing that a lot of Chianti Classico Reserva would end up having there would be tannic structure kind of coaxed out from oak influence, from long oak barrel influence, or Brunello, think of Brunello. Whereas this is basically like a fresh version of that. It's like if you took those pieces of like ripe juiciness and kept them a little fresher, more acidic, like you said, Ned, but you still had all that stuff, you still had that like nice weighty, kind of meaty, juicy kind of backbone to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think I personally love wines like that. I think that I think that if you're watching the natural wine world right now, like things are going away from that right now, which I mean, it's a different story. My personal take is like we shouldn't do that to all the wines in the world. We shouldn't just turn them all into like 11% or 10% alcohol wines when they don't have to be. But because there's room for wines like this, and I think they're really satisfying. When it gets down to it, 12.5, 13.5% alcohol is like, when it's the right wine, it's really balanced and delicious, and I think that's what the El Rosso is all about.
Yeah, this is, this to me, like it's also savory and like woodsy and spicy and earthy and stuff like that. But 13% alcohol, like that, like again, which is a classic Sangiovese, like a lot of tannin, a lot of acidity, but not super ripe, like not a ton of alcohol. It doesn't have a ton of sugar in the grapes. but it can have a lot of flavor, and that's also another Sangiovese thing. Like you have some Sangioveses, because there's so many different clones and versions of all these different grapes that do different things. Like some Sangioveses are really bright and fruity, and then you have it depending on like how productive the vines were and how much skin contact the wine had and stuff like that. Then you have wines on the other like end of the spectrum like this that are like darker and spicier and like deeper and more savory, and this manages to have like great acidity and be a pretty fresh wine, but it is a like a dark, denser, spicy sort of like more powerful wine that, yeah, to me, like spaghetti and meatballs or like braised meat or something like that.
Totally.
It's what it makes me think of.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then
You guys like that one? It's showing well today.
yeah, no, that it's showing great. I think I opened one of these like really, I forget when or where, but I opened one of these really recently for some other reason, because this is just sort of one of my perpetual favorites. Like I like this, that it's I like that it is more serious and sort of substantial. Like it's just a little bit more traditional while still being like, I don't know, like delicious and alive. Because I guess I agree with you. Like I don't know. I don't just want to drink things that are like simple and thirst quenching and like
Exactly.
suave wines. I mean, I think those wines are kind of sort of easier to make. Like I get the sense from talking to a lot of winemakers that making like wines that are like 11.5 or 12% alcohol, that have high acidity, that don't have a lot of like skin contact, like those are easier wines to make. You can make those with grapes that are not quite as ripe, and it's less risky to harvest grapes when they're a little bit less ripe and all of that, and like skin contact can be less. And yeah, so there's a
you don't have to age them. You can make them and sell them in 3 months. You know what I mean? And yeah, but I 100% agree, and I think this is like all wine shouldn't go that direction. I think there's a place for ripe grapes, healthy fruit, and wines that are like I remember when I was running a retail shop, like 13%, like, oh wow, 13%, like this
that's really low.
not 14.5%, like, and now if it's 13%, it sounds like it's a bomb, and you're just like, no, this is actually just delicious, like ripe grapes, and yeah, I there's always a time and place, and I love thirst wines, and I love like the fresh and fruity and easy stuff, but personally, when I sit down sometimes to a glass of Sangiovese, like that's kind of what I want to come out of the bottle, is the Il Rosa,
Yeah. All right. So wine number 6 is actually not one of yours. So you are totally welcome to.
That's right. I saw you. So this is a Montefalco. That's a great producer. Awesome. You know these guys well.
Right. I know them well. I visit them a lot. But this is interesting. That this sort of goes to one of the things you were talking about earlier. So actually, before I start talking about this, I'm going to screen share, and I'm going to go to this picture, because this picture is awesome. There.
That's awesome.
This picture is awesome. Big
lunch.
Yep. Yeah. This was after like Sunday lunch.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You need to send me this photo. This is amazing. This is Vittorio Mattioli and Danilo Marcucci chatting about God knows what, but definitely Danilo's like totally zoned out.
Yeah. And yeah, it was after Sunday lunch, like eating a bunch of like wild birds that they had shot for me, and then bones and all. I forget what they were talking about, like like someone's mother, or like local politics or something like that.
I'm sure.
It was, or they might have been talking about like Danilo's parents or something like that, and how like what Danilo should do as a good son. I think it might have been something like that.
That's amazing.
Yeah. That's amazing. But anyway, so then hold on, let me pour this wine, and then I will hop on over there. Yeah, anyway. So Moretti Omero, I should actually go and find the pictures on here of when I ran to Moretti Omero back in 2017, because there's a lot of pictures of like rural on the way, like running through Montefalco. Moretti O'Mara is at like the southern edge of Montefalco, one of the highest spots in the appellation. I didn't know that when I decided to run there, but so it meant I had to run through the entire appellation of Montefalco and run up to this, like onto the top of this ridge. So it was like 30 something miles, and it was the end of it. The last like 2 miles were just up, like just nothing but just up, running uphill to get there. But when I started working with them, they make this wine. They're like entry level wine. It is called Terra di Giano because they're in this little commune of Giano. And when I first started working with them, the Terra di Giano was like mostly Sangiovese, with some like some Ciliegiolo, a little bit of Montepulciano, a little bit of Merlot in it for blending and stuff like that. And what was the last vintage I got? I think the last vintage I got of the Terra di Giano from them was 2018, and that was 85% Ciliegiolo now.
Nice.
So they've, in the space of like 5 or 6 years, they have shifted from making, well, like back then, like I guess if you were making like red wine in Umbria and you wanted people to take you seriously, you had to make wine that was, you like use a lot of Sangiovese and stuff like that. And now they have shifted to making, to that wine being, I think in the current vintage, like 2020 is going to be maybe 100% Ciliegiolo. When I was there I'm going to go back to screen share and go forward. So this is in their winery, and that is that's Omero. He started the winery. He was born here in Giano, grew up here, and I forget how many acres they have. It's like 14 hectares, 15 hectares, or something like that. I guess that he has bought a lot of that. When he was younger, they had like a small farm, and he actually started out raising pigs, but they didn't have enough land, and the neighbors all kept complaining to the authorities about the smell and stuff like that. And so finally, he quit raising pigs. It was in like 1991. So Montefalco Rosso and Sagrantino di Montefalco were both created as DOCs in 1979. And then Sagrantino was elevated to being a DOCG in, I think it was 1992. And so I think it was 1991 that he sort of like, he'd seen Montefalco Rosso like start to take off. And he, I guess, like knew that Sagrantino, or like Sagrantino was becoming more famous and people were talking about it becoming a DOCG. And so he decided, he was like, all right, I'm going to just stop raising pigs, sell all the pigs. I'm going to start buying vineyards. I'm going to plant vines. I'm going to become a winemaker. So he didn't come from a winemaking background. He was a farmer. But he saw what was happening, that wine was becoming like the new thing. And so he decided to become a winemaker. This is a new, I want to say it was like 3 or 4 acres that they had just bought, and they planted all of this to Ciliegiolo and Malvasia. And it was like, they were really excited about it. And it was sort of a big deal that like, instead of planting Sangiovese or Merlot or something like that, they were like, no, we're going to plant Ciliegiolo and Malvasia here because like these are local varietals. These are what we like working with, and they're great, and and it's going to work well here and stuff. So anyway, this was that's
a great photo. But it's also an important thing because like, this is like what I was saying earlier, Ned. It's like Montefalco is its own little microcosm, but the grape Ciliegiolo for sure. Like, I mean, I've been talking to producers for a long time now and sort of saying like there is a market, there's a future for grapes like Ciliegiolo, because the reason they planted Merlot and Cabernet and Syrah and all this stuff was because like in the 80s and 90s, like that's what Robert Parker wines wanted. They wanted these like deep, dense oak aged 14.5% alcohol wines, and they went and planted them. But then the shame about that is those grapes don't come from there. They don't belong there. And grapes like Ciliegiolo come from there, belong there, they thrive there. And if you make the wines the right way, you can get people to really enjoy them and taste the history of the place. And I think that that's like, to me, that's like the most rewarding thing, is to see a producer like this see that and go, I'm not going to plant this to Merlot or Cabernet. I'm going to plant this to Chiligiolo and Malvasia. I think that's a huge thing. I think that that gets overlooked on our side of the pond and in our kind of world often. But these folks here have to be looking 10, 15, 20 years down the road when they plant a vineyard like that, because you can't just change it all the time. And
Right.
so, yeah, it's an important thing to think about. I think that's really cool. And that's awesome that they're putting more Chiligiolo in the table wine. It's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. He's a constant tinkerer.
Great.
When I went here the first time in 2017, I ran there, and I was, originally I was going to meet with like his daughter, because his daughter speaks a bunch of English. He doesn't speak any English, but she had some kind of thing she had to do. So like I got there, took me all day to run there. I finally got there, and I would run like 30 something miles and didn't know who I was, and
Yeah, you're like, hey, I'm here. You're like,
yeah, and it
I
was like
need
just
water.
him. And so he was like, all right, like, well, first he just like took me into the tasting room and just started giving me wine, because that was
That's
like
always
what they
amazing.
do. And so we started talking. I started talking to him in my broken Italian and stuff like that. And then he was like, all right, well, like, you need dinner, like, we'll go out and we'll get dinner. And it was, I forget what it was, like a Monday or something, something stupid like that. So the first restaurant we went to was closed. We finally we found like a restaurant that was open, and had dinner, had this big dinner, and it was actually great. Like, we talked about, like, his background and life, and like his, like, raising kids and being a farmer, everything that he'd done. Um, and he really, like, he's a farmer, like, he's constantly trying to do things better, and he's just willing to experiment, because he didn't, I don't know whether it's because he didn't come from a winemaking background, and he does other things. He has about as many acres of olive trees as he does grapevines. He's actually really famous for his olive oil, and like makes as much money on olive oil as he does wine. um but he was just constantly sort of like trying to experiment and improve and like learn from what was happening in other places and stuff like that. Um, I forget when they got certified organic, but they got certified organic really early. Um, when a thing that I loved about him, when we were first talking, he showed me the label, and he was like, you see this? Like, he was like,
Got
that's not me. And I was like, yeah, okay. And he was like, look at my face. Nobody wants to look at a picture of me on a wine label. My face isn't going to sell a bottle of wine. So I used this Greek statue of Jupiter. I used that for the label for my wine label. He had a real, like, sense of humor, and was kind of self-deprecating and stuff like that. But he's been working organically for, since nearly the beginning. And these are fermented with native yeast. He's done a lot of sort of like work and tinkering and study with that. This is aged in oak for a while. This spends a year in like large old oak barrels, and you can kind of smell some of that in the aroma. It's a mix of old oak and some newer small Bordeaux barrels that give it some of that sort of oaky aroma. And it's mostly Sangiovese. I want to say off the top of my head, I think Montefalco Rosso is supposed to be like 85% Sangiovese. And then you can use Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Sagrantino in it. I know that he uses Chiligiolo and Montepulciano in it as well, which is not allowed. And at some point he was telling me like, oh, this Montepulciano and this Chiligiolo goes into my Montefalco, and I was like, wait, is that allowed? And he was like, I do it. It was some kind of just like, it's what I do. Sort of with the same sort of with that same smile. With Let me go back to that. With that was the look on his face when I asked him about putting Chiligiolo and Montepulciano in his Montefalco Rosso. Um, I've always liked these wines, and I like them because they're really nice people, and they make really good wines, and they've just constantly been experimenting and trying to like make better wines while still like really sort of, being themselves and being who they are. They're very very proud of where they are. They're very proud of their location here and how high elevation it is. I'll try to find that. I have a couple pictures of like looking out from that vineyard. Yeah. Yeah, this was when I ran there. Yeah, so these are their vineyards. So they're very exposed. So they harvest later than the rest of Montefalco, and the grapes, like the wines, usually have more tannin and more acidity because of that. I mean, yeah, worth talking about. Sagrantino. Sagrantino is also famous for sweet wine, for Sagrantino Passito. Those are Sagrantino grapes that he was drying. He had like a garage, basically a garage full of Sagrantino Passito that he was drying, and they were like, there's all of them. And he was like, and it makes amazing wine. And he was like, I basically sell it at cost. It's just great to make. It's important. It's special.
Yeah.
So we do it, but it's just so much work that it's not actually profitable. There's this little winery, and this was on the way running to. There's a Lancia Fulvia that drove by me. This was on the way running to his winery. Those are some of his olive trees out there.
Awesome. Yeah, and Montefalco, like I was saying earlier in the beginning, Montefalco, like as a town, it's probably the most recognizable internationally in terms of Umbrian wine villages, and it certainly has the most expensive wines in Umbria, for what they can ask for them. But not to say that this wine is the expensive one. I'm saying like the tier, the top tier of them is probably, there's $100 bottles of Sagrantino that exist, whereas there's no $100 bottles of Cepiolo or whatever, you know what I mean? It's just a different world. But it's because it's that wine village, and it's become really synonymous with the Sagrantino grape variety. And, it's exploded since the 80s. I don't know how many there is now, but it's one of those wine towns that went from having like 20 small winemakers like 30 years ago to probably having like over 100 now. It's a crazy phenomenon, and it's a good thing. It brings lots of interested people to a really cool little town, and it has great wine and great tradition. And the Sagrantino, I mean, the grape variety it means Sagra in Italian means festival, means holy. So it's sort of like, it was the wine that they used for special occasions, and then the Passito grape variety, or the Passito method, was how they would tame the very tannic structure of that, almost like Amarone, in terms of the style of letting the grapes dry. So yeah, Montefalco always intrigued me. I used to ride my bike there when I lived in Perugia. I love that little town. And yeah, it's a cool spot. And I always loved the lesser wines of Montefalco, like the Montefalco Rossos personally, because they have a little more character, a little more drinkable than pure Sagrantino is sometimes. And like, I think they just offer that versatility, like the El Rosso. Just like when you drink that wine, it's just like generous, and like it's just there, and it's not trying to be something it's not. It's not trying to be a 11% pet nat.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, definitely. This is darker, denser. This is richer. This probably has about the same amount of acidity and tannin as the Il Rosso, but this is 14% alcohol. This is
a little more spice, a little more weight to it.
Yeah.
Plus the oak aging will concentrate that a little bit. There'll be a little more evaporation and more concentration.
Yeah, and probably harvested a little bit later because he was going for that, for like higher alcohol, for more richness. The mid palate is really chocolatey on this to me. It's a like rounder, richer, riper, more chocolatey, like savory, like more expansive red wine compared to the Il Rosso. You don't taste the tannin and the acidity as much as I did in the Il Rosso, but I think they're probably just about the same acidity and tannin wise. This one just has a lot more fruit to it and alcohol that like clothes all of that structure and makes it like a more expansive, sort of lush sort of wine.
Yeah. Exactly. It's cool.
Yeah. Umbria. So I mean so we've hit wines and winemakers and stuff. Umbria, like pulling this all together, it doesn't have like the cohesive personality of like Chianti. Not that Chianti has a cohesive personality, but like to an extent they do.
Yeah.
You know, Umbria is more. Umbria has I feel like they have more of a history of like spread out, like farming. It's not like large agribusiness or anything like that in Umbria. But the wines, like in the past, like 30, 40 years, like winemaking has gotten more and more serious in Umbria. And like there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's there. People talk about Umbria like culturally and architecturally as being this sort of like really well preserved, like microcosm of like medieval Italy. Like there's all these really cool medieval hill towns that have beautiful architecture, and these buildings are still there, and you have like all these incredible churches and things. And to an extent, like winemaking and culturally and food wise, Umbria it has that there as well. Like it's like calling it a backwater is not quite the right sort of thing or way to look at it, but it's like Umbria has been a little bit removed and a little bit protected. And so you have all of these like local idiosyncrasies and grape varieties and traditions and winemaking sort of like approaches that you find in Umbria that in other places, like in a lot of Tuscany and stuff, like they got lost as Tuscany was like became this international phenomenon. So it's cool getting to like see these wines and like see things like this come out of Umbria.
Hi, cat. My cat's coming. I agree. I think that that's part of the charm of Umbria in general, because, yeah, and I think it's really cool because there's this sort of dichotomy between it being a really almost like a lost world in some ways, both like linguistically, architecturally, historically, but then it's also become in the last decade or so a real hotbed for like really progressive natural or just progressive winemaking in general. Like a little bit in like you see in other to draw a parallel, something like the Auvergne in France, it reminds me of. It's a place where like it's isolated. It has like a small little group of producers, but those producers are coming from like a place where there's no grand tradition. It doesn't, they're a little bit like unchained, unbound from that concept of this is what we do in this area. And so there's a little more willingness if the producers are willing. It always depends on the producer's perspective, because there's a lot of producers out there that are just super stubborn and go like, this is what I make and I'm just going to always make this. But if you have these, especially someone like Federico Tiberi, this guy who's inspired, he's like, yeah, let's do everything. Let's like make fizzy wines in Umbria, and let's also make orange wines from 120-year-old vines. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's the type of thing that I think is beautiful about what's going on in Umbria right now. And like, I see it more and more. Like when I started out working with Umbrian wines, like people I would go around the country and talk to about Umbria, and no one even knew what I was talking about. And now there's more Umbrian wine coming into the outside world, coming from Umbria into America or wherever, than I've ever thought possible, honestly. So it's really been amazing to see. And so I say, keep flying the flag high, keep your eyes open on Umbria, follow these producers because they keep evolving. Every vintage gets more and more interesting. And yeah, I mean, it's a great spot. It's a great spot to be making wine and visiting and drinking wines from. So
yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks for
you
coming and
guys.
talking about Umbria.
Hopefully that was good, and hopefully I didn't bore you all to death. But yeah, thank you, Ned, for having me come and do this. This was super fun.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, hopefully I'll see you sometime soon.
Definitely. Yeah, I think we're getting close. All right.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody.
You
Thanks a
got
lot.
it.
See you
Thanks,
next week.
Ned. Ciao, ciao.